In the middle of a lavish dinner party, the millionaire Ethan Cole stated coldly, $1 million for one night with me. But with a single reply, the waitress, Grace, stunned the entire dining hall into silence. No one suspected that in that moment, his reputation would be destroyed, beginning a painful journey of redemption. Do you believe a single sentence can change a life? And when power confronts dignity, who is the true victor? Watch until the end, because the truth behind The Dinner of Shadows will leave you captivated. Maison Bleue was not a place for newcomers to the world of luxury. Tucked away on a quiet street in the Upper East Side, the restaurant exuded a proud, classic elegance. Bronze chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow onto crisp white tablecloths, and the soft strains of a piano provided an air of sophistication without intruding on one's privacy. It was a place people came to display their wealth discreetly, and to be seen without having to say a word. At precisely 7:30 p.m., Ethan Cole walked in. At 45, he was an icon of the New York investment world, cold, precise, and famous for his ruthless, cutthroat decisions. His perfectly tailored grey suit was merely an outer shell. What truly intimidated others was his gaze. The look of a man who always knew he held the deciding power. At his side was Veronica Hale, his private secretary, a woman many mistook for an equal partner. She radiated a confidence honed by years in the financial sector. Her blonde hair in a neat bun, a form-fitting black dress, and a perfume so refined it could be mistaken for arrogance. Veronica was the kind of woman who walked as if the entire room belonged to her. They were led to a VIP table behind a carved wooden screen. As soon as they were seated, a server appeared, her voice low and clear. "Good evening. My name is Grace Miller, and I will be your server tonight." Grace was petite, around 27, with her brown hair tied back neatly. Nothing about her stood out except for her eyes, so calm they were difficult for others to read. When she looked up, her gaze briefly met Veronica's. It was just for a second, without words or a smile, a flicker of vague recognition, like a spark between two people who had known each other before. Veronica's lips tightened into a thin line, her expression cold. She remembered instantly. Grace Miller, a former classmate from college, the one who had refused her invitation to join her sorority. She still had that same irritating composure. "Miss Miller," Veronica began, her tone flat, "is the sea base any better than last week's?" It was a bit dry then. I dislike repeated mistakes. Her voice was level, more of a command than a question. Grace replied, her tone unruffled. "I understand. I will speak directly with the chef to adjust the temperature and time, Ms. Hale." A sly glint crossed Veronica's lips. She noticed Grace had used her last name with the precise intonation of a former peer, not a servant. Meanwhile, Ethan remained engrossed in his phone, checking the Asian markets. He paid no attention until he heard Veronica whisper, "She always acts as if she's above her job." People like that only pretend to be humble, Ethan. In this city, kindness always has a price. That remark caught his ear. Price. A familiar word. He didn't look up, but his mind had already registered the question. A few minutes later, Grace returned with a bottle of red wine in a wicker basket. She poured a sample, her movements careful and precise. As she leaned over to pour for Ethan, she noticed a young boy in the corner of the room spill his orange juice and burst into tears. Terrified, without a second thought, she set the wine basket down and hurried over to the other table. Kneeling, she gently wiped the floor, reassuring the boy, "It's okay, sweetie. Accidents happen to everyone." Her voice was just soft enough to calm the mother and soothe the boy's fear. It was a small, ordinary scene, but it caught Ethan's eye. He watched her, and a part of him, the part that was always suspicious, began to stir. Years in the business world had taught him that every act of kindness could be staged. And with people like Grace, composed, controlled, knowing just what to say, everything could be a performance. She's acting, Ethan thought, and she's very good at it. When Grace returned, her face was placid, only her breathing slightly rushed. She picked up the wine basket and resumed her work. But Ethan was now watching her every move. A cold thought crept into his mind, to test just how real that composure was. "Miss Miller," he said, as she began to pour his glass. Grace paused, the bottle tilted slightly in her hand. Ethan looked directly at her, his voice even, neither loud nor soft. "If you need money that badly, I'll give you $1 million, for just one night. Let's be direct." The words fell like shattering glass in the silent room. Veronica froze, her eyes wide with shock for a moment, before a cold smile spread across her face. Grace stood motionless, her hand tightening on the neck of the bottle, the blood in her veins seeming to stop. But instead of reacting, she placed the bottle on the table so slowly that every movement echoed in the dead quiet. She looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with a gaze so steady and clear it could make a person recoil. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, each word distinct, "the richest person in this room isn't the one with the most money, but the one who still knows respect. And clearly, tonight, that is not you." She gave a slight bow, a gesture that was both a farewell and a final word. Then she turned and walked straight into the kitchen. No one spoke. Only the piano music continued its steady, gentle, and now painful melody. Ethan didn't move. He felt something break in the air, small but sharp. To anyone else, her words were just a rebuke, but to him, they struck the deepest core of his pride. He looked at the untouched glass of wine, its red surface reflecting his own face, cold and solitary. In that moment, Ethan realized he had just said something that even he found despicable. The room seemed to hold its breath for several seconds. Even Veronica, so confident she was controlling the game, dared not break the silence. In a corner of the room, a young man, Sam Walker, an amateur blogger, set his phone down on the table. He had just managed to record the entire scene, from Ethan's proposition to Grace's response. Outside, New York was still roaring, but inside Maison Bleue, all the lights seemed to dim. No one knew that in just a few hours, this short video would spread across the internet and shatter the orderly world Ethan Cole believed was unshakable. The next morning, the New York sky was overcast, with fog blurring the glass skyscrapers. The crowd still hurried along, but the air felt heavy, as if carrying the consequences of a night filled with rumors. Ethan stepped out of his car, his suit jacket perfectly pressed, his appearance as flawless as ever. The doorman bowed, and Ethan gave a slight nod, his gaze fixed on the lobby of the Cole Capital Group building. Inside his 40th floor office, there was an unusual, hushed atmosphere. Whispers were exchanged, half hidden, half meant to be overheard. "Did you see that clip? My God, did he really say that?" Someone said the girl's reaction was terrifyingly calm. The more everyone tried to act normal, the more tense the room became. Ethan walked in, and the glass door closed behind him, cutting off the murmurs from outside. On his desk, his phone buzzed incessantly. Notifications, emails, headlines reading, "Image Crisis, CEO Ethan Cole, Controversial Statement." He glanced at them, then turned off the screen. "Don't send me that stuff," he told Daniel, his voice calm. "I have real work to do." But Daniel knew better. When his boss was this quiet, it meant something inside was cracking. It wasn't anger, but self-loathing. All morning, Ethan worked as if nothing had happened. Shareholder meetings, report approvals, document signings. Occasionally, he would look up, gazing through the misty glass where the rain had not yet stopped. The media, he thought, was always loud and quick to forget. The news could kill a reputation in a day and forget it in 3. He told himself, in 3 days, this will all be over. But deep down, something told him it wouldn't. On the other side of the city, Maison Bleue was no longer a place of tranquility. Curious glances and undisguised whispers filled the air. Grace moved among them, carrying water, wiping tables, wearing the same smile as any other day. The only difference was that today, the smile didn't reach her eyes. In the kitchen, someone whispered, "That's her, the waitress from the clip." Another added, "She looks pretty ordinary in person." She heard them, but didn't react. The worst part wasn't what they were saying. It was that they believed they had the right to say it. Mr. Harris, the manager, called her into the small office behind the bar. His voice was low and sincere. "Grace, just keep doing your job as usual. I received a few strange calls this morning, asking about you. I made it clear that my employees are not for outsiders to slander. If anyone wants to cause trouble, they'll have to go through our lawyers." She nodded slightly. "Thank you, sir. I understand." Her voice was strangely calm, the calm of someone accustomed to enduring pain in silence. Just as she left the office, the restaurant door opened. The sharp click-clack of high heels echoed through the room. Veronica Hale appeared, her expensive perfume preceding her gaze. "Hello," she said with a cold smile. "I'd like to see the manager." Harris stepped forward, politely. "I'm the manager. How can I help you?" Veronica's eyes darted toward Grace, who was standing in the distance. "Her, that waitress. I think you should recheck her background. Someone who would entertain an indecent proposal in public probably shouldn't be representing a restaurant like this." The air grew thick. Grace stood still, saying nothing, but her hands clenched tightly. Harris looked at Veronica, his voice slow and even. "Thank you, ma'am. But here, we don't judge people by rumors." Veronica raised an eyebrow. "Rumors? I was there. I know what kind of person she is." Harris smiled, a faint, sad smile. "If you had ever worked in the service industry, you would understand. Customers have the right to judge the food, but not the person." The words hung in the air, soft but heavy. Veronica froze. For a moment, she lost her composure. Then, clutching her handbag, she turned and left, leaving behind a thick cloud of perfume. All that remained was the scent of luxury, and the feeling that a person could be impoverished in soul. Grace stood behind the counter, silently watching her go. She had heard everything. She didn't react. She didn't need to, because sometimes silence is the only voice dignity has left. Harris walked over to her and said quietly, "Don't pay her any mind, Grace. In life, some people are only happy when they see others being dragged down." She bowed her head, her voice trembling, but still soft. "Thank you, sir. I'll finish my shift." Evening fell. The restaurant began to empty. Grace sat in the break room, looking out a small window. The sunset cast a glow that highlighted the tired lines on her face. She opened her phone. An anonymous message. "Gold-digging waitress." Well played. She deleted it, but the words remained imprinted in her mind like indelible ink. She asked herself, is kindness always misunderstood in a world of people who believe everything has a price? The question had no answer, only a lingering silence that filled her chest. She kept working, wiping tables, greeting guests, but each movement felt a little heavier. In the dim light, she looked like someone standing in a storm, trying to keep a small candle from being extinguished. Late at night. Ethan left his office and stepped onto the street. The sky was clearer, than it had been that morning, with a crisp winter wind. Daniel drove up to pick him up, his voice low. "Would you like me to turn off the media notifications, sir?" "The press has been talking about last night all day," Ethan replied, his eyes on the distance. "Leave them. Let them write what they want. I don't have time for that garbage." Daniel nodded, but he knew. This indifference wasn't calmness, but emptiness. At that same moment, at Maison Bleue, the young woman he had insulted was wiping the very same table from the night before, the spot where he had sat, where his words lingered like an invisible knife in the air. Grace put down her cloth and stood silently. The city lights were on. Inside her, everything was still dark. As she locked up to go home, she looked up at the sky. A few faint stars twinkled. She took a deep breath, as if trying to shake off the dust of the long day. "Maybe tomorrow they'll forget," she whispered. "But I won't." Because, even though everyone told her she was strong, deep down, Grace still wondered, why did he say that? Was it just about the money? Or did he truly believe I was that kind of person? She had no answer. She only knew that from that moment on, she no longer trusted people like Ethan Cole. The rumors didn't disappear. They just changed form. 3 days after the clip went viral, the name Grace Miller was still splashed across the homepage of the City Buzz. Public curiosity was a ravenous beast that could never be sated. Customers no longer came to Maison Bleue just for the food or its luxurious reputation. They came to see the million-dollar girl in the flesh. Maison Bleue was busier than usual, but the atmosphere had grown tense. Grace kept her head down, working as she always did, clearing tables, pouring water, smiling. Everything followed procedure. Only the eyes of those around her were wrong. She could feel their prying gazes, the intentionally loud whispers behind her back. Every comment was an invisible cut, slowly bleeding her spirit dry. Grace learned to take shallow breaths, to keep her facial muscles still, and to make her ears temporarily deaf. She had to work. She needed the money. One evening, while serving table 4, a man in a dark suit, with a fleshy face and a smile full of contempt. He called her over after finishing half a bottle of expensive wine. "Hey you," he said, his voice mocking, deliberately loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I hear you're worth $1 million. So what if I only have 100? Would you even look at me?" The next table erupted in laughter, as if it were a hilarious joke. Grace stood motionless, her hands gripping the silver serving tray. Her knuckles were white. Her lips trembled with suppressed emotion, but her voice was frighteningly calm. "Please don't joke like that, sir. I'm just doing my job." The man shrugged nonchalantly. "Doing your job? In this city, nobody's clean, girl. You're no different. Everyone has a price." Grace felt her stomach clench. His last words were like a knife twisted into the deepest part of her self-respect. She remained silent, bowed her head, and mechanically cleared a broken glass from the table. When she got to the kitchen, she had to lean against the wall for a long moment. Breathe in, hold it. But tears had already started to fall. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, feeling her resilience nearing its limit. The manager, Mr. Harris, the grey-haired man who had trusted her unconditionally, walked over. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Grace, if this is too much, I can move you to a less crowded section." She shook her head. "It's okay. I'm fine." She said it, but her voice was broken. But later that night, as the sound of laughter and clinking silverware still echoed through the hall, she realized she couldn't pretend anymore. She set down her tray, untied her pristine white apron, and said quietly to the manager, "I'd like to request a few days off, Mr. Harris. I need to breathe." The manager sighed, his face full of regret. "Grace, I know you're innocent. But let me talk to the director. If we can just endure this for another week—" "There's no need, sir," Grace interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp and cold. "I just need some silence for a while." With that, she folded her apron, placed it neatly on the counter, and walked straight out the door. She didn't look back. Outside, the sky was darkening, and a damp, cold Manhattan wind blew through the street. Grace descended the steps, her mind a blank. She just wanted to get away from this place as quickly as possible. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she collided hard with a man walking in the opposite direction. Thud. The impact threw her off balance, and she crumpled onto the wet flagstones. Her purse flew open, and her cheap cell phone skidded across the pavement. A hand reached out to help. She recognized the expensive black coat and the wristwatch she had seen in that fateful moment a few days ago. A deep, familiar voice spoke, tinged with an unconscious irony, as if commenting on a minor traffic incident. "Careful. The $1 million girl shouldn't be falling like that." Grace looked up. Ethan Cole. He stood before her, the streetlights casting shadows on his angular face. He no longer had the cold, emotionless expression from that night, but his indifference still wounded her. She got to her feet, avoiding his hand. Her chest tightened, her breath caught, and her eyes stung. She didn't know if the tears were from anger or despair. The pent-up rage suddenly erupted. "Did you come here to see what I look like after being smeared? Did you just finish a board meeting and now have so much free time you can go for a stroll, Mr. Cole?" Grace's voice was hoarse. Ethan Cole frowned. "I didn't think you'd be so fragile. I thought you were stronger than that." His words weren't meant as an insult, but they felt like a final blow. They invalidated her entire struggle. Grace felt hot tears stream down her face. She couldn't hold back any longer. These were not tears of weakness, but of fury. She didn't sob. She just let the tears fall as she unleashed her bitter words. "You don't know anything," she screamed. "You say one thing and walk away." "The whole world tears me apart because of your mouth. I've lost my job, my dignity. And you? You're still sitting up in your high tower, calling it all a misunderstanding." She pointed a trembling finger at herself. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be looked at like trash every single day? Did you ever stop to think that one of your comments could destroy a life? It's not me. It's you who's selling your own dignity cheap." Ethan Cole, who had never been spoken to like that by anyone, stood frozen. His face was a mask, but deep inside, Grace's words had struck a nerve he had long since numbed. It was the raw truth, unvarnished, not for sale. Grace bent down, hastily grabbing her purse and phone. "If you really want to help, then stay out of my sight." With that, Grace turned and walked away, not waiting for a reaction. Her small silhouette disappeared down the quiet street. Ethan remained standing there, under the dim streetlight. He raised a hand, touching the spot where Grace had fallen. For the first time, he felt a true sense of shame. Not for losing money, but for losing his own dignity. He turned and walked into Maison Bleue. Mr. Harris was at the counter, closing out the books for the night. Ethan paused, his voice low, stripped of its usual command. "The young woman who just left, Grace Miller. Could you give me her contact information?" Mr. Harris looked Ethan straight in the eye, his gaze wary and tinged with clear contempt. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not at liberty to disclose my employees' personal information, especially not to the people who have caused them harm." Mr. Harris did not hesitate to refuse, protecting his former employee. Ethan fell silent, then nodded in acceptance. He knew he deserved the rejection. That night, Ethan returned to his penthouse. His luxurious apartment felt emptier than ever. Veronica was waiting for him, dressed in a silk robe, a glass of wine already poured. "You look tired. What's wrong?" Veronica placed the glass on the table, trying to approach him. Ethan Cole walked past her without a glance. "I don't need anything." Veronica maintained her sweet tone. "I just want to help you relax. It's not worth worrying about. She's just a waitress." Ethan stopped and turned. His eyes were no longer cold, but filled with disappointment. That kind of thinking is exactly why all of this happened. Veronica was momentarily stunned by his sudden coldness. Ethan continued walking straight into his study. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. In his mind, only Grace's indignant words echoed. He switched on the intercom. "Daniel," Ethan called his assistant, his voice having regained the decisiveness of a man in charge. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to find everything you can on Grace Miller. Personal file, college, work history, current address. Everything." Daniel, who had witnessed his boss's stress all week, didn't dare ask any questions. He worked quickly. Half an hour later, what Ethan saw on his screen left him completely stunned. That morning, a thin layer of fog covered the city, and the pale sunlight was too weak to penetrate the high-rise windows of the Cole Capital Group building. Ethan sat at his desk, his shirt still wrinkled, his tie unknotted after a sleepless night. The vast office was so quiet, he could hear the ticking of the clock, each second a reminder that it was time to face something. An email had just appeared in his inbox, with a concise subject line, "Information on Grace Miller." It was from Daniel, his assistant. Ethan opened the email. The first few lines appeared on the screen, and within seconds, the color drained from his face. He read slowly, word by word, as if afraid of misunderstanding. Then he read it again. His usually composed gaze fell, heavy with disbelief. Something in those lines made the man who had signed hundreds of contracts unable to sit still. Ethan leaned back in his chair, took a deep breath, and clenched his fists. He said nothing, called no one, just quietly closed his laptop and sat in silence for several minutes. Daniel knocked and peeked in. "Sir, do you need me to—" "No," Ethan cut him off, his voice low. "I need a quiet morning." At the same time, a few blocks away in Manhattan, Grace Miller was packing up her small rented apartment. All that was left on the floor was a grey suitcase, an old teapot, and a small photo of her with former colleagues at last year's Christmas party. She folded each piece of clothing neatly, unhurried, but her eyes were different. They no longer held the same light. For the past week, the restaurant had been constantly packed, and the customers' gazes were all the same, curious, contemptuous, or pitying. That evening, Grace sent a short email to her manager. "Thank you for believing in me. But I can't let the restaurant's reputation be damaged because of me." No one knew she was leaving that morning. She chose silence, because sometimes silence is the only way left to preserve a little self-respect. The long-distance bus left Manhattan at noon. Through the window, the tall buildings gradually shrank. On Grace's lap was a notebook with a worn leather cover. She opened it and reread a line she had written in the days when she still believed that hard work was enough. "No one can make you feel small unless you allow them to." Now, the words sounded more like a self-reassurance than a conviction. As the bus turned onto the highway heading north, a sign appeared, "Welcome to Willow Creek." It was the small coastal town she had chosen. No one there knew of Maison Bleue, no one read the City Buzz blog, and most importantly, no one knew her as the $1 Million Girl. Helen's Diner was on the main street corner, its pale blue sign faded but cozy. The owner, Helen, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s with silver hair, looked her up and down as she took her application. "Where did you work before?" "In Manhattan, a restaurant called Maison Bleue. Sounds fancy," Helen said, half curious, half concerned. "Are you sure you want to work here?" "We just sell coffee, pies, and the soup of the day." Grace smiled, a small but genuine smile. I don't need fancy. I just need peace. Helen nodded and handed her an apron. Good. Around here we don't judge. If you wash the mugs clean, I'll call you a colleague. Grace chuckled softly. It was her first real smile in days. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Ethan Cole walked into the grand lobby of a marble building, the headquarters of Wong Hospitality Group. The receptionist recognized him and bowed. Good afternoon, Mr. Cole. Mr. Wong is waiting for you on the 14th floor. Ethan nodded and stepped into the elevator. His heart beat slowly but heavily, as if each passing floor added another layer of memory he couldn't remove. When the doors opened, Richard Wong, a man in his 50s in a dark suit, was standing by the window, looking down at the street. Ethan approached him directly. Mr. Wong, I have a question. Go ahead. Do you know a Grace Miller? Richard turned slowly. His expression was unreadable. I know many people with the last name Miller. To whom are you referring? Ethan looked him straight in the eye. She used to work at Maison Bleue. I just want to know who she really is. Richard was silent for a few seconds. He poured a cup of tea and placed it on the table between them. Why do you want to know? Because there are things I need to understand. I owe her an apology. And maybe more than that. Richard looked out the window, where rain had begun to fall. If you're sincere, don't ask others. The only person who can tell you is her. Ethan clenched his hand slightly and nodded. The conversation ended abruptly, but something inside him had just shifted. That evening, Ethan returned home. The apartment was dead silent. He turned on the lights and opened his laptop. A new email from Daniel was in his inbox. No subject, just a single line of text. Grace Miller, Willow Creek, Maine. The cursor blinked on the screen. Ethan placed his hand on the keyboard, then pulled it back. He sat still, looking out the window. The rain continued to fall, a steady, rhythmic sound, like the city's breathing. For the first time, Ethan didn't know what to do. He had made decisions in hundreds of meetings, had made entire markets bend to his will. But now, a single small decision, typing a woman's name into a search bar, made him hesitate. In his mind, Grace's voice echoed as clearly as it had that night. Did you ever stop to think that one of your comments could destroy a life? Ethan closed his eyes. When he opened them, the words were still on the screen, silent and heavy. Willow Creek, Maine. He hadn't pressed enter yet, but it no longer mattered, because from that moment on, he knew, somehow, he would have to see her again. The sun rose more slowly than usual over New York. Grey clouds drifted past the glass skyscrapers, reflecting the lights of offices already switched on. In an empty conference room, Ethan Cole sat alone. The cup of coffee in front of him had long gone cold. He watched the last wisp of steam fade from the rim, as if seeing the final warmth of his fallen pride. The door opened quietly. Veronica entered, impeccable, smelling of expensive perfume, and still wearing the smile he had once thought was genuine. "You wanted to see me?" she asked. Ethan nodded, pushing a newspaper toward her. "I just wanted to ask, why was the news about that waitress so distorted? Photos were cropped, words I never said appeared everywhere." Veronica smiled faintly, her voice smooth. "You know how the tabloids are. In New York, a small story can turn into a hurricane." Ethan looked at her for a long time. "I don't believe in coincidences," he said, his voice soft but heavy. She tilted her head, her eyes a mix of challenge and defiance. "Are you suspecting me? If I could control the media, I'd probably be sitting in your chair by now." He didn't answer, just let out a soft breath. "Regardless," Ethan said, "the truth finds its way home sooner or later." Veronica smiled, placing a light hand on his shoulder. You should forget about her, Ethan. She's not worth it. Ethan avoided her gaze, his voice low as if speaking to himself. Maybe I just want to understand where I went wrong. The door closed. In the lingering silence, the scent of her perfume mingled with the smell of cold coffee, strong, bitter and weary. Veronica paused in the hallway, the smile on her lips fading. She looked back at the newspaper, her finger tracing the bold headline, "The $1,000,000 Waitress, the year's most suspicious woman." Her eyes were as cold as steel. "You won't disappear that easily," she whispered. Afternoon. A persistent drizzle blurred the signs in Midtown Manhattan. Ethan drove out of the city center, aimlessly. The wind whipped through the cracked open window, carrying the smell of gasoline and damp air. He didn't know where he was going, only that if he stayed in the office any longer, he would suffocate. On his phone screen, Daniel's email was still there, the short line of text, "Grace Miller, Willow Creek, Maine." Ethan stared at it for a long time, then said quietly to himself, as if giving an order, "I'm going." Willow Creek greeted him with a silver-grey sky and the smell of damp wood. A small town, so quiet it seemed to exist in a different time. Old shops stood side by side, their signs faded. The wind carried the scent of roasted coffee and rain. Ethan parked in front of a small diner with a pale blue sign, Helen's Diner. A bell chimed as he walked in. An older woman behind the counter looked up. "Coffee, sir?" "Yes, black, no sugar." He chose a seat by the window and sat down. Dim light filtered through the fogged-up glass. The clink of a spoon against a cup echoed like the slow rhythm of a memory. A moment later, a low, warm female voice spoke from behind him. "Excuse me, may I clear this table?" Ethan turned around. Grace was standing there. Her hair was tied back, she wore a white shirt, and her simple face seemed to glow in the afternoon light. They both froze. She spoke first, her voice calm, but distant. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you." "Why?" "Because I don't believe what people are saying about you is true. I needed to see for myself that you were okay." Grace was silent. The wind blew through the doorway, making the thin curtain sway. She sat down across from him, her hands resting lightly on her tray. "You didn't need to come here," she said softly. "I'm not your problem anymore." Ethan looked down, his voice slow. "Maybe I just wanted to apologize, the right way." She smiled, a smile sadder than tears. "An apology doesn't erase anything. But thank you for at least realizing that." Outside, a truck drove by, its engine making the window pane vibrate slightly. They sat in silence. There was nothing left to say. Grace stood up, her voice gentle but firm. "I have to get back to work. Your coffee's getting cold." Ethan nodded. "I'll be in town for a few days. If there's anything I can do—" "I don't need help," she cut him off. "I just need peace." She turned and walked away. Her figure grew smaller in the soft yellow light. Ethan remained seated. On the table, the cup of coffee was still warm, the only thing left after their conversation. He watched the thin wisp of steam rise and disappear, whispering to himself, "Just like my pride, gone, leaving only the gentle scent of regret." Night. A small motel room at the edge of town was dimly lit. Ethan sat by the window, watching the rain fall on the old storefronts. He opened his phone and deleted Veronica's messages one by one, without reading them. With each deletion, the screen flared, like a light fading inside him. He spoke softly, his voice a near whisper. "I just want to know if a person can start over, the way she has." In New York, amid the glittering lights, Veronica stared at her laptop screen. A news site showed a picture of Ethan in Willow Creek with the caption, CEO Ethan Cole, spotted in Maine, seen visiting a local diner. The wine glass in her hand tilted, leaving a red stain on its rim. "You won't let her go, will you?" she said quietly. Then she picked up her phone, her voice cold. "I need information on Grace Miller, Willow Creek, Maine." As soon as possible, the man on the other end replied, "To what extent?" Enough to make him regret ever looking for her. She hung up. In the wine glass, her reflection was distorted, smeared like a bloodstain in water. Outside, the city still blazed, and another storm was slowly gathering. In her high-rise apartment in New York, Veronica sat silently on the sofa, a glass of red wine swirling in her hand. The light from her laptop screen reflected on her face, as cold and perfect as a porcelain statue. On the screen was a news alert. Ethan Cole, spotted in Willow Creek with Grace Miller. She set the glass down, the crimson liquid shimmering in the lamplight. "You haven't changed, Ethan," she said softly, her voice low and calm. "Always believing you can save someone, just because they know how to bow their head." No smile, no anger, just a long sigh. She made a call, her voice even. "I need someone in Maine." "Track their every move." The voice on the other end replied, "Understood, ma'am." When the call ended, Veronica looked out at the fog-covered window. Her voice faded into the silence. "She's living the life that should have been mine." Early morning in Willow Creek, fog shrouded the entrance to the soup kitchen. Grace, wearing a grey cardigan, arranged food containers with careful, peaceful movements, like a small ritual. She didn't know that from a distance. Someone was taking pictures, sending each one back to New York. In her Manhattan apartment, Veronica opened her phone. The photos appeared. Grace handing a meal to a child, the early morning light illuminating her gentle face. Veronica stared for a long time, then smiled faintly. "Noble, is she?" she whispered. "No one is more noble than anyone else. They just know how to act differently." An hour later, social media was flooded with an anonymous post. Grace Miller, the waitress who once baited a millionaire, now backed by her father to open a charity kitchen. Comments poured in, a mix of fact and fiction. At Helen's diner, Helen put down her phone and sighed. "Grace, you're all over the internet again." Grace read the post in silence. After a moment, she said quietly, "It's okay, as long as I'm still doing the right thing." But as Helen turned away, Grace's hand clenched, her knuckles white, as if holding onto the last shreds of her composure. Afternoon fell. The rain had stopped. Behind the soup kitchen was an old wall, peeling and stained. Grace brought out a can of paint, opened the lid, and the smell of paint mingled with the wind. A familiar deep voice spoke from behind her. "That color suits you." Grace spun around, startled. Ethan was standing there, holding a can of paint, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a few white smudges on his wrist. "What are you doing here?" "Paying a debt," he answered softly. "By painting a wall?" "Maybe. I've ruined a lot of things, with just words." Grace let out a small laugh, her first in weeks. "You're the strangest man I've ever met." Ethan smiled. "At least today, I've learned that silence is more valuable than words." They painted together. The sound of brushes against the wall mixed with the afternoon wind and the distant laughter of children playing. Sunlight cast a glow on the fresh paint, a warm orange-white, like a breath of fresh air. After a while, Ethan said quietly, "I know you're Richard Wong's daughter." Grace's hand froze, her paintbrush hovering in mid-air. "And?" "I don't understand," he said slowly. "You could have had an easy life, but you chose this path. Why?" She set her brush down, her voice low. "Do you think I did it for pity?" "No," Ethan replied. "I think you were just trying to be yourself. and I forgot how to do that a long time ago." Grace was silent, the sunlight through the doorway illuminating her tired but serene face. "I'm not strong, Mr. Cole," she said quietly. "I just ran out of other options." She handed him a rag. "You have paint on your hands." Ethan looked down at the white smudges on his hands and smiled faintly. "Maybe for the first time, I feel dirty without feeling ashamed." They sat on the steps. No one spoke, only the smell of fresh paint and the sound of the wind. In the silence, it seemed as if they were both repainting a part of themselves. Late night, New York. In a car parked under a streetlight, Veronica opened her phone. A message appeared. Ethan and Grace, working together at the nursing home. She read it, her eyes still cold. "Did you think I would just stand by and watch, Ethan?" she whispered, then called a familiar reporter. "I have an exclusive story for you. A powerful CEO and the daughter of Richard Wong, the man he once ruined. Interested?" The voice on the other end hesitated. "Are you sure about your source?" "Positive," she replied, her voice flat. "Just write it exactly as I tell you." When the call ended, she leaned her head back against the seat. The city lights reflected in her eyes, blurred and cold. "He chose kindness," she whispered, "and I choose the truth. And sometimes, the truth is crueler than any lie." That night, Willow Creek was silent. Ethan sat by the window of his motel room, watching the rain fall on the small street. Grace's question still echoed in his mind. "If I were just a waitress, would you still have come?" He didn't know the answer, only that the look in her eyes made him want to be forgiven, not just by her, but by himself. On the table was an old photo from Grace's file, a young girl smiling brightly next to her father, a paintbrush in her hand. Ethan touched the photo lightly and whispered, "Maybe redemption doesn't start with fixing mistakes, but with learning to see others without judgment." Outside, the rain continued to fall, and in two different places, a man and a woman were both awake in the silence, each in their own way. The morning after their volunteer work at the nursing home, dim light filtered through the blinds, falling on the desk where Ethan had been sitting since the night before. Only a cold cup of coffee proved he hadn't slept. The sound of rain outside mingled with the ringing of his phone. He ignored it until Daniel walked in, his face tense. "You should see this." On the iPad screen, Grace was walking out of the nursing home, holding a white envelope. The video's headline, "Waitress once shamed, now taking money from charity fund." Below it, Veronica Hale had shared the post with the comment, "Some people never change." The words were like a cold knife. Ethan set his coffee cup down, his expression darkening. "She's starting again, but I never thought she would sink this low." He put on his jacket and left the office, leaving behind the steady sound of the rain. In Brooklyn, Grace looked at the newspaper with her picture on it, her smile blurred in the grainy light. "Volunteer accused of embezzling funds." She said softly, "That was a donation receipt, not money." Mr. Harris sighed. "I believe you. But management is asking you to take a temporary leave." She folded her apron and nodded slightly. "Thank you for being honest with me." Outside the door, Veronica was waiting. "Oh, you're still here?" A smart person would know when to retreat. Grace looked her straight in the eye. "If you have something to say it." "I'm not good at playing games with words." Veronica gave a faint smile. "Ethan was mine. He would never hold hands with a waitress." "Don't delude yourself," Grace replied softly. "How pitiful." "You think everyone is acting, except for you." Veronica walked away, the sound of her heels cold and sharp. Mr. Harris came out and said quietly, Don't let her drag you down. Grace just smiled, her eyes welling up. I won't fall. I'm just tired. Evening fell. The rain grew heavier. Grace sat on the porch, watching people walk by under their umbrellas. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, hundreds of hateful messages. No one is that good. She turned off the phone, clutching it in her hand. She felt both helpless and angry with herself. A black car pulled up. Ethan got out, his coat soaked, his tie loose, stripped of his powerful CEO persona. Where is she? Miss Grace just left, the shift worker said. Ethan stood silently in the rain. In the wind, he seemed to hear a question echo back. Am I going to let her get hurt again? Because of me? Night descended. The apartment was quiet, the city lights casting a glow on his weary face. On the TV, a news report replayed the scene of Grace walking in the rain, with a chyron that read, "The girl who broke the internet, now accused of abusing trust." Ethan turned off the TV, opened his laptop, and slowly replayed the original clip. At frame 35, he saw the nursing home's logo clearly printed on the envelope. It wasn't cash. The light reflected in his eyes, moist and dim. His voice trembled slightly. How could I let someone like her suffer another wound? Because of me. On the other side of the city, Richard Wong, Grace's father, sat in his old office, watching the same clip. His assistant asked, "Sir, would you like to make a statement?" He shook his head. "No, my daughter doesn't need anyone to protect her. She just needs to be believed late at night." Ethan sat alone with his cold coffee. On his phone, Veronica Hale's name appeared. He hesitated, then didn't call. Instead, he opened an email and typed a short line. "I want to see you. Tomorrow. Let's talk about everything." The blue light from the screen reflected on his face. Cold, but with a small spark of awakening in his eyes. Outside, thunder rumbled. A storm was coming, not just from the sky, but from all the things he had kept silent about for too long. Morning in New York. The top floor of the coal capital headquarters was as quiet as a forgotten room. The glass door was slightly ajar, and the early morning wind blew in, gently flipping through the files on the wooden desk. Ethan walked in. The light reflected on his face, both firm and weary. In his hand was a small USB drive, glittering like a fragment of the truth. Veronica looked up, a half-smile on her face. "You're back? I heard you were in Maine for quite a while." Ethan placed the USB drive on the table, his voice chillingly calm. "You fabricated the clip." "Why?" The question made the air stand still. Veronica let out a soft laugh, a smile as thin as a razor's edge. "Because you were letting your emotions destroy you. I was just pulling you back to reality. A CEO can't be led around by a waitress." Ethan looked at her for a long time. "Emotions don't destroy me," he replied, "but lies do." He leaned forward, pushing the USB drive toward her. Inside is the original footage for the nursing home's security camera. "Do you know what it shows?" The truth, Veronica was silent. The light fell on her face, revealing a fleeting tremor in the corner of her eye. A tiny shard of fear or regret. No one could tell. Ethan continued, his voice slow and steady. "You once told me to forget her. But maybe what you were afraid of was that I was starting to remember." He turned and walked out of the room. When the door closed, Veronica was left alone, in a space that was both luxurious and empty. Outside, clouds drifted past the building, casting a haze on the glass like dust on a tarnished reputation. That same afternoon, in Willow Creek, the charity kitchen was closed. Grace was clearing the tables, listening to her phone buzz incessantly. On the screen, a series of new headlines. Grace Miller, the hidden daughter of restaurant tycoon Richard Wong. Waitress returns to New York, coinciding with CEO Ethan Cole's press conference. She sighed and looked out the window. Outside, sunlight pierced through the mist, illuminating the sparkling dust on the road, a small but persistent light. She knew she couldn't hide forever. That afternoon, Grace took the train back to New York, not to run, but to face what was coming. She went to the Daily Ledger newsroom. The reporter, Sam Walker, who had once written the scathing article about her, looked up when he saw her. "You're Grace Miller. I thought you'd never come back." She placed a small USB drive on his desk. "This is the original video from the nursing home's camera. You wrote something false about me. Now I want you to write again. The truth." Sam looked at her, a mixture of shame and caution on his face. "If I was wrong, I'll fix it. But I'll need more proof." Grace said softly, "Watch it until the end. You'll see who was lying." She left the room, leaving behind the scent of damp wood and the gaze of someone who had finally set down a heavy burden. Night. In the empty newsroom, Sam opened the video. The light from the screen reflected on his face, each frame landing like a silent blow. Veronica appeared clearly in the footage, handing an envelope to a man, Jonathan Reed, a business rival of Cole Capital. At the same time, attached files from the system log appeared, emails, text messages, plans to spread fake news to discredit Ethan and slander Grace. Sam leaned back in his chair and whispered, "A power play." But they forgot that the truth has a memory. He turned on his recorder, his voice trembling with indignation. Special report, when the truth is for sale. The next morning, New York greeted the day with a rare, clear sky. The grand lobby of Cole Capital was packed. Camera flashes went off relentlessly. Ethan stepped up to the podium. He held no notes, needed no script. He was just a man speaking from his conscience. "A year ago," he began, "I humiliated a young woman in front of a crowd. I called it the truth of the wealthy. It turns out I was the one who was blind. Today, I choose to protect her. In the same way I once destroyed her, publicly." The hall fell silent, as if holding its breath. A reporter shouted, "Are you referring to Grace Miller, Richard Wong's daughter?" Ethan looked directly into the camera. "No, I'm referring to Grace Miller, a person who doesn't need a father or anyone else to deserve respect." The words rang out, simple yet powerful. For a moment, the hundreds of bright lights seemed to soften. Sam Walker stepped forward, holding up a copy of an email. "We have evidence that Veronica Hale, Mr. Cole's former assistant, conspired with Jonathan Reed to spread false information. Everything has been verified." The sound of camera shutters exploded. Veronica, watching the live broadcast from her high-rise apartment, gripped her wine glass tightly. The glass shattered, red wine spilling onto the stone floor like a spreading memory, but her face remained still, her eyes gazing into the distance, where a light rain began to fall over New York. After the press conference, the crowd slowly dispersed. Ethan walked down the steps, the wind blowing through his jacket. In the empty hallway, Grace was standing there, quiet, calm, as if she were just passing by. They said nothing for a few seconds. Then Ethan spoke softly, his voice low and sincere. "Thank you for not staying silent." Grace looked at him, her gaze gentle but firm. "If people lie with noise, I choose to tell the truth with silence." Ethan bowed his head. A raindrop fell on his graying hair. In that moment, nothing more needed to be said. They both understood. The truth is never loud, but it is bright enough to illuminate everything. Elsewhere, Richard Wong sat in his old office. On the screen was an image of Ethan bowing his thanks to the media before leaving the podium. Richard closed his laptop, his voice low and raspy. "It's time to meet with Ethan Cole. He looked up at an old photo on the wall, a young Grace, smiling brightly in a kitchen, a paintbrush in her hand. He smiled, his eyes warming. "My daughter, he has finally learned how to respect you." Outside, a light rain was falling, but the city no longer felt gloomy. An old chapter had closed, in the quiet light of the truth's return. The rain from the night of the press conference had just stopped. The sky was unusually clear, as if the city itself had been cleansed after so many tumultuous days. Ethan stood before the glass facade of the Wong Group building, his hands in his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on the company nameplate reflecting the morning sun. He knew today's meeting wasn't about business, but about responsibility. A secretary led him into a quiet room. Richard Wong was already seated. On the table was a single teapot, steam rising from its spout. There were no secretaries, no lawyers, no contracts between them. Richard looked up, his voice slow and steady. "You've come to apologize?" Ethan replied, "No. I've come to take responsibility." The air was as heavy as dust settled after a storm. Richard poured tea, placing a cup in front of Ethan, but he didn't offer it. "Do you know how many people were hurt by your mistake? Not just my daughter, but your employees, the people who once believed in the name Ethan Cole." Ethan looked down at the teacup, the steam blurring his vision. "I know. I'm not asking for her forgiveness. I just want to atone. I'm working to heal, starting with the smallest things." Richard was silent. For a moment, the ticking of the clock was the only sound. He stood up and walked to the window. Healing isn't easy. But if you're sincere, prove it by not backing down from public opinion, even when she doesn't stand with you. Ethan nodded. "I don't need her to stand with me. I just need her to never have to bow her head because of me again." Richard turned back, his gaze softer. "Good. I just wanted to be sure that this time you understand the value of a person's word." At the same time, in South Brooklyn, Grace was teaching at a community career center. The room was small, with white-painted walls and a few old desks, but the atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter. Before her was a group of young adults, dropouts, people who had lost their jobs, people who believed opportunity wasn't for them. Grace stood by the whiteboard, marker in hand, speaking slowly. "Mistakes don't define who you are. How you correct them does." She looked at the young faces, listening intently, her eyes softening. Perhaps this was what brought her peace, not reputation, but the ability to help someone find themselves again, just as she had. After the class, she stepped out into the courtyard. The sun was gentle, and the wind carried the smell of baking bread from a nearby shop. A black car stopped at the corner of the street. The window rolled down. Ethan was inside. He didn't get out, just watched quietly through the glass as she spoke with a student, a folder still in her hand. In the sunlight, she looked serene and confident. No longer the humiliated waitress from Maison Bleue. No longer the woman battling rumors. Ethan smiled faintly, a smile mixed with regret and pride. He knew he shouldn't interrupt that. Not now. He said quietly to himself, "Just let her be. Maybe that's the best way I can make amends." Then the car pulled away, merging into the flow of traffic. That evening, at the Cole Capital office, Daniel entered and placed a white envelope on the desk, an invitation from the Wong Group. They would like you to attend the signing ceremony for the strategic partnership between the two corporations. The guest list is attached. Ethan opened the envelope. When he reached the last page, his gaze froze. One name stood out among the dozens of other guests: Veronica Hale. He leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. "She can still show her face in places like this?" Daniel replied, "I heard she's trying to get back into the industry." A few people still fear her because of her old connections. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. A person can rebuild a career, but not a lost character. Daniel looked at him, hesitating. "Will you go, sir?" "I have to. Not for the contract, but because an ending needs a proper close." On the other side of the city, Grace received a similar letter. The Wong Group logo was printed on the envelope, in her father's formal handwriting. "You should come. It's time you saw the answer for yourself." She held the letter for a long time. A light breeze swept by, making the paper tremble. She looked at her reflection in the glass, no longer a frightened girl, but a woman strong enough to face her past. Grace folded the letter and placed it on the table. "If this is the end, I want it to happen in front of me, not behind my back." That night, both Ethan and Grace sat alone in different rooms in the same city. The same letter, the same words inviting them to tomorrow's signing ceremony. Neither knew that the guest list also included Veronica Hale, the woman who had made them both pay a price for the past. Final scene. The camera slowly pans. Through the windows of two buildings a few blocks apart, a soft yellow light shines out, illuminating two faces looking toward the future. One carries the determination to atone. The other carries a pain that needs closure. And somewhere in the city, Veronica's shadow appears in the reflection of a shop window, a faint smile on her lips. A sign that tomorrow night will not just be a contract signing, but a final confrontation with karma. The morning was brilliant. Sunlight reflected off the glass walls of Regency Hall, the venue for the partnership signing between Cole Capital Group and Wong Group. A stream of guests flowed into the grand hall, the atmosphere both formal and electric. The press lined up outside, ready for a ceremony everyone knew would be a turning point for both corporations, and for the people behind them. Ethan entered the hall, his grey suit fitting perfectly, his expression composed. He paused when he saw Grace talking with some Wong Group employees. She wore a simple white dress, her makeup minimal, but she radiated a quiet, effortless confidence. When their eyes met, neither spoke, just a nod of greeting, a silent acknowledgement that they had weathered the storm. Richard stepped up to the podium, his voice clear and steady through the microphone. "Today, we are not just signing a contract. We are signing a commitment to respect human dignity, no matter who a person is or what position they once held." The room applauded. Ethan looked up, the light catching his face. A brief moment, but it brought a warmth to his chest. Amid the applause, the doors to the hall swung open. Veronica Hale walked in. She wore a black dress, her hair in soft waves, her smile tinged with irony. The sound of her high heels echoed through the hall, as if to announce, "I'm still here." "Sorry I'm late," Veronica said loudly, deliberately drawing all the cameras to her. "I came to offer my congratulations and to remind everyone that sometimes the winner isn't the best person, but the one who knows when to play their cards." No one responded. All eyes turned to Richard. He remained calm, simply saying, "Miss Hale, we have something else to announce today. Something bigger than numbers." He gestured for Grace to come forward. She approached the podium, a folder in her hand. "I would like to present a small part of an investigation conducted by journalist Sam Walker. This email chain, along with the full report, has been sent to the district attorney's office." She opened the folder and a projection appeared on the screen. A series of emails materialized, Veronica discussing with Jonathan Reed, Ethan's rival, how to edit the video and spread false news to damage both corporations' reputations. The entire hall was dead silent. Veronica was stunned, but then she laughed out loud. "You think a few emails can bring me down? I was just doing my job." It was all for the press. Grace looked her straight in the eye. "The press is never an excuse to destroy a person." Ethan stepped forward, his gaze calm, his voice even. "You once asked me why I believed a waitress. I'll answer you now, because she knew how to bow down, to help others, while still holding on to her dignity." Veronica sneered. "You think you can fall in love with a waitress?" Ethan replied, his voice soft but firm. "No, I fell in love with someone who knows that compassion is worth more than power." A reporter's camera flashed, capturing the moment. For a few seconds, the only sounds in the hall were shutters clicking and held breaths. Before anyone could react, 2 detectives entered and presented their credentials. "Ms. Veronica Hale, you are under arrest for fabricating evidence and media manipulation causing personal injury to reputation." Veronica struggled, shouting, "You'll all regret this." But no one answered. They just watched as she was led away, the once powerful woman, now small and empty. After the ceremony, Richard approached Ethan, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You kept your promise. You protected my daughter with actions, not just words. Perhaps I was too harsh." He looked over at Grace, his voice softening. "If you can forgive, I have no reason to stand in the way." Grace was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, "I haven't forgotten what happened, but I believe anyone who knows how to make amends deserves a second chance." Ethan replied quietly, "I will never forget where that chance came from." The hall was still brightly lit, but in their eyes there seemed to be a different kind of light, one that comes from forgiveness. 1 year later, Helen's Diner was now a proud recipient of funding from the Second Light Charity Center. It was a mild afternoon in Brooklyn. A new sign hung in front of the Second Light Charity Center, a place where those who have fallen can start again. Grace was guiding a group of young students on how to write a job application. Ethan sat at a nearby table, reviewing funding proposals. He was no longer a cold CEO, just a calm man learning to listen. A young man asked, "Miss Grace, were you ever afraid of being misunderstood?" She smiled. "Of course. But then I realized what's important isn't who understands you, but how you live after being misunderstood." Ethan looked at her, his gaze soft. He walked over and said quietly, "I used to think happiness was standing at the top, looking down. Now I know it's here, where we learn to stand beside each other." She smiled back. "Because it's only when we bend down that we can truly see others." Late afternoon, they left the center and walked along the Hudson River. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the water. Ethan stopped and handed her a small ticket. "A year ago, I used money to buy silence. Today, I'm using faith to ask for a beginning." Grace looked at the ticket, then at him. "I don't forgive you because you were rich. I forgive you because you learned how to be poor, poor in arrogance, but rich in heart." They looked toward the horizon, where the sun was about to set. A gentle breeze swept by, carrying the distant sound of a piano from a riverside cafe, the melody of the nocturne that had once played at Maison Bleue. Ethan smiled and said softly, "It sounds like the end of a long lesson." Grace nodded, her eyes warm. "No, this is just the beginning." A bird soared across the orange-red sky, its reflection gliding on the calm water. They walked on together, their long shadows stretching along the embankment, merging with the light of the sunset, a place where the past was closed and a new life was beginning. In that bustling city, 2 people had once stood at opposite ends of pride and pain. Ethan, who believed money could buy anything. Grace, who thought silence was the only way to preserve her dignity. But as the stained wall was repainted, they both realized some cracks don't need to be hidden, only touched by truth and kindness. Ethan did not atone with money, but by learning to bend down. And Grace did not seek revenge with resentment, but by continuing to do what was right. They came together not to change the past, but to understand that sometimes forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about stopping so you don't cause any more hurt. This story, if you look closely, isn't just about a CEO and a waitress. It's about us, all of us, who have misspoken, who have judged someone by their station in life. And then, as time passes, we come to understand the most precious thing isn't power or fame, but the ability to see another person through the eyes of compassion. If you've ever experienced a misunderstanding, a wound that made you close yourself off, remember, just one small act, one sincere word, can open a door again. Thank you for listening to the end. I want to ask, if it were you, would you have the courage to forgive, not the other person, but yourself, as Grace did? Please share your thoughts below. I'll be here, reading every comment, as we all learn to soothe our old wounds together.